Hello, everyone. This is going to be nowhere near as entertaining or fun as John Green's crash course in history, but I'll do the best I can. So, there's a lot of information that we've gone over, and I don't want to take a whole lot more time on this section. I know it's not the most exciting, but it's really important. So, I want to review some information with you here so you can work on it at home. Okay, so a question. How is it that the US went from John Smith, Pocahontas, starvation time to being the global superpower that it is today? Okay, so some things that you need to keep in mind. Remember the Virginia Company, that company that sponsored the settlers to move into Jamestown, would have loved to have had an encomienda system like they did in Spain, where all the power was in the hands of just a few people. That would have been lovely. But they couldn't. Why couldn't they? One, because the population density of the US was far lower than Mexico and Peru. In other words, there were not these cities that there were in Mexico and Peru. There was a lot of open landscape, which means if you didn't like what was happening, you could run away. Okay, that wasn't so possible in Mexico and Peru. All right, it was more of a wild frontier in the US. Far fewer people. So related to that, it's much easier to control people if they are in cities and they are connected by roads and so on. And in America, things were more spread out. Okay, so that is what stood in the way of the Virginia Company creating their own version of an encomienda system. So instead of that, the Virginia Company had to create incentives for people to move to America. So let's talk a minute about what incentives are. Okay, so what is an incentive? It's a benefit or reward you receive for your efforts. You can think about it in this way. If, no matter how hard you worked in humanities class, the highest mark you would ever receive would be a 3 or a 2 or something like that. What's the likelihood that you would continue working hard? Very little, right? Because you would feel, look, why am I working so hard when all I'm doing is getting these low marks? Okay, so your incentive is that if you work hard, you get high marks. Okay, the same thing goes with this settling of the US. Okay, the first incentive that we talked about was the headright system. Okay, remember they got 50 acres of land. And not only were settlers given land and a home, but by 1619, remember this is a little over 10 years after they first arrived, a General Assembly was introduced in Virginia, which was the beginning of a democracy. Okay, that's a really important point to remember. Okay, barely 10 years after the settlers first arrived in the US, the beginnings of democracy were starting to develop. It's going to be very, very, very different in Mexico. Okay, so by the 1720s, the 13 original colonies, okay, there's the US, and here were the first 13 original colonies. By 1720s, all of the colonies had some level of democracy, and by 1787, all the US was governed by a constitution, which those of you that were around for the first unit on government, you remember it's a set of laws that govern society, okay? So about 150 years after the original settlers came, the entire country was governed by a set of laws. All right. So how does this constitution and democracy link to wealth? Important points. Wealth comes from at least two main things, maybe others. One is that people make investments, and two, people are innovative. Okay, think Mark Zuckerberg and the CEOs of companies like Amazon and Google and Uber and all these lovely applications, Snapchat. Okay, those are innovative people, they're creative people. But this depends on a strong and stable government. Okay, so if you're in a government that's governed by laws, you feel safe investing your money, and you believe that if you're creative, you will be rewarded. Okay, if you were in a country where no matter how creative you were, you had no chance of getting into a good university or making money because it's all about who you know rather than what you do, you're not going to be coming up with these amazing inventions. Okay, so that's a link between having a constitutional democracy that's governed by laws rather than a form of government like a dictatorship where people can take from you whenever they choose. Okay, it's sometimes called corruption. There's a link there, you can go further with it. So what happened in Mexico? Okay, during the Industrial Revolution that we've talked about, there were a lot of opportunities to get really rich. Okay, sort of like today, you all are living in a very unique time with the internet. It's a bit like the Wild West again, where if you have an idea and people like it, you can get amazingly wealthy. All right, well, it was sort of like that in the Industrial Revolution. And when you have an invention, you're given something called a patent, okay? And that protects your ideas from being stolen. Hopefully some of you will have patents one day on these amazing ideas. So check out the statistics. Between 1820 and 1945, only 20% of people receiving patents in the United States were from wealthy families, okay? 1 in 5 of those people, all right? So it's not about the connections or the family you come from. It's everyone has an opportunity to get wealthy. That's the point of that statement there. However, it's not enough to have an idea and a patent. You also need money to turn it into a reality, okay? You need, and this is what's meant by an investor. You need someone who believes in you. So this is where banks come in. Some more statistics. Okay, I need you to hang in here. Even those of you that are not mathematically inclined, surprise yourself. I bet you're amazing with math if you want to be, if it means something to you. So in 1818, there were 338 banks in the U.S., but where it gets interesting is by 1914, there were 27,864 banks with total assets, that's total wealth of $27 billion. Okay? So there was lots of money that investors could use to start businesses. That's great if you want to start a business, right? You need money. On the flip side, in Mexico, around that same time, there were 42 banks, okay? Notice, U.S., there's 27,864. In Mexico, there are 42. 2 of these banks in Mexico controlled 60% of all the wealth, all right? Why? Because there was no competition between banks. Remember capitalism? We talked about this competition between people. That wasn't happening in Mexico. So because there's no competition, banks could charge investors or people that wanted to get loans very high interest rates. They could say, okay, fine, we'll loan you $1 million, but in 2 years you have to pay it all back, and you have to give us $2 million back. All right, they could do that because they didn't have any competition that would give people a better deal. All right. Moreover, these loans in Mexico would typically go to people who were already powerful or wealthy, people that had connections, right? I think in those of you that speak some Mandarin, I think guanxi is a word here, right? It's a lot about who you know, okay? And that had a way of keeping wealth in the hands of the few, all right? Think of the encomienda system, right? The social structure there. You just have a few landowners that really control a lot of the wealth, and then the majority of the people really have nothing. But now we're not talking about the 1500s anymore, we're talking about 1900. So this encomienda system didn't change that much, and that's the point. To sum up, unlike in Mexico, the citizens, because they had political rights, could have access to loans, which meant that their ideas and inventions would benefit them. There were incentives to be creative, okay? And they took advantage of that. And they continue to take advantage of it, right? There's a reason Silicon Valley is where it is in California, and it's not in Afghanistan, okay? In Mexico, on the other hand, the encomienda system, there were no political rights given to citizens. Only the powerful people had political rights. And as a result, there were no incentives to make people invent or do creative things, because they felt that why should I be creative and amazing when it doesn't matter? I have no opportunities, because if I'm not connected to the powerful people, then I'm not going to get anything in return. Okay? So in the US, people had political rights that were protected by law, incentives to work hard, be creative, invent, and make loads of money. All right, so what do you need to know and understand? Let me pause here for a minute. Tomorrow, we are going to do a bit of a I'll call it a quiz, but it's really not. More of a gallery walk, and you need your phones for this, but I'll post this on ManageBack. Okay, so what do you need to know and understand? When you're thinking about why one country is rich and another country is poor, in addition to geography, like Jared Diamond said, you also have to think about the historical context. What are the two histories of these countries? And how might the histories of the countries explain why one is so different from the other? That's very important. Related to this, the Spanish encomienda system remained in place for almost 300 years, in the sense that the economic and political power stayed in the hands of the few. In the US, economic and political rights were established a little over 10 years after they arrived. Okay, in the US, they were established 10 years after they arrived. In Mexico, around 300 years. That's a very important difference. When people believe their hard work will be rewarded, they are more likely to be creative and therefore generate wealth. In the US, these incentives were there from the beginning. In Mexico, even today, it is hard to get rich unless you have connection. There should be an S there, sorry. Therefore, okay, and I hope that you can relate to those images and you can understand them, right? That's the wall separating the US from Mexico. It explains why there is a wall there, and it explains why on one side of the wall people have a lot more wealth than on the other side. It's not the only explanation. It's one explanation, but it's an important one and one that I want you all to understand and remember going forward. Thank you for your time.